Hey there, welcome back to Finding Jesus. We call these our Friday favorites. So each Friday we're digging into scripture and talking about some of my favorite women in the Bible. Not necessarily because they did great things, some of them did not so great things, but either way we're digging into their lives, reading some scripture and seeing what God has to say to us through these women of the Bible. So we're in Genesis, we're just going straight through the Old Testament right now. And last week we talked about a woman who's really not commonly spoken about. We talked about Hagar. She was the maidservant of Abraham and Sarah. And, we talked about how Abraham had received this promise from God that he would be a father of many nations. And Sarah, his wife, had the bright idea to actually try to fulfill that promise through her servant Hagar. So we talked about Hagar last week, and this week I want to talk about Sarah, because on the other side of Hagar's story is Sarah. Now, God's promise was for a large family, but this seemed impossible. The word was given to Abraham, but it was actually confirmed to Sarah. So she didn't just have to take his word for it. An angel of the Lord actually appeared to Sarah as well and gave her this promise. And I'm going to read this for us. This comes from Genesis chapter 18, and we're going to start in verse 10. The Lord said, I will certainly come back to you in about a year's time, and your wife Sarah will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent behind him, so she was in on this. Abraham and Sarah were old and getting on in years. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Side note, like way past. I think it was like 90. And these days, like if you have children over the age of 30, they say that you're advanced maternal age. So fun fact, times have changed. So Sarah laughed to herself, and she said, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I have delight? But the Lord asked Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, can I really have a baby when I'm old? Is anything impossible for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will come back to you, and in about a year she will have a son. Now Sarah denied it and said, I didn't laugh, she said, because she was afraid. But he replied, no, you did laugh. So Sarah looked at this promise that God had given her, but she also looked at her circumstance, which just seemed impossible. Like, God, we have not been able to have a child for all of these years in our marriage and our covenant together, and now you're saying we're in our 90s and you're going to give us a child? Like, how is that even possible? And I think that we can learn a lot from Sarah, because I think a lot of us have been given promises from God, either promises that we can find directly in Scripture or promises that we've just felt spoken to our hearts, whether it's for an unbelieving spouse or a child that has strayed from the faith. A lot of the times we have these promises from God, but we look at the circumstances and we say, this just seems impossible. This seems hopeless. So Sarah may not be a great role model for us, because like we talked about last week, she took matters into her own hands. She tried having that promise through her servant Hagar, but there are a few things that we can learn from her. One is that God's plan for your life doesn't change just because we get impatient and try to take things into our own hands. God's promise was still fulfilled, even though they had that little veer off, of course, where they tried doing things their own way. And the second takeaway, I think, is that God's promise for our lives doesn't change even when we have doubts. Now, Sarah was embarrassed because she laughed, and God was like, why did you laugh? I didn't laugh. Yeah, you did. I heard you. I could just see that happening. But the fact of the matter is that God didn't get angry at Sarah for laughing. He didn't strip the promise away from her. I think he recognized that as humans, a lot of the times we have doubt. And I just want to encourage you today that if you're hanging on to God's promises and you're declaring scripture over your life and believing for certain things, it's okay if you have doubts. Just don't live in them. Trust God and His goodness and His faithfulness, and that He'll come through and that He'll do exactly what He promised. In fact, there's scripture in the New Testament, one of the people that Jesus healed, he said, I do believe, but help my unbelief. And sometimes that's my prayer, is God, I believe your word, but in the areas that I have doubt, would you just help me? So I'm praying that over you today, that you'll stand firm in the promises that God's given you. Will you drop in the comments below and just let me know, what are you believing God for? What promises from Scripture are you hanging on to? I would love to stand with you and pray with you. This really is an online community. It's not just me talking at you, so I would love to hear what you're standing for, what you're believing for, and let us join you in praying for that. I love you guys, and we'll see you next Friday for our Friday favorites.